April 4th, 1949, marked the beginning of a new journey that would last forever. Washington, D.C. A small conference room hosts delegates from 12 nations, each recovering from the scars of a world war that ended just 4 years earlier. In a single act, they sign a treaty that will shape global politics for the next 7 decades. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was born. But its creation is not simply a story of diplomacy. It is a story of fear, ambition, and the precarious balance of power in a world teetering on the edge of another war. This is the story of NATO, how it began, how it evolved, and why it remains one of the most powerful alliances in human history. Europe lay in smoldering ruins in April 1945. Cities that had once pulsed with life, Berlin, Warsaw, Paris, and London, were reduced to skeletal remains, the echoes of bombings and artillery fire still lingering in the air. Millions of civilians wandered through shattered streets, displaced, hungry, grieving the loss of family, homes, and the familiar rhythms of daily life. Economies had collapsed under the strain of total war. Factories were destroyed, railways severed, ports inoperable, and agricultural systems disrupted. Entire nations faced the daunting task of rebuilding not only infrastructure but social order itself. Yet amid this devastation, a more insidious tension began to creep across the continent. The ideological fault lines that would soon define the Cold War. The alliances that had united the world against Nazi Germany were fraying. The United States, Britain, and France, although victorious, were exhausted and wary. They had poured immense resources and blood into a war that had demanded the total mobilization of their societies, and now they faced the enormous challenge of ensuring stability in a continent ravaged by conflict. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, which had borne the brunt of the German advance on the Eastern Front and suffered staggering losses estimated at over 20 million people, emerged not only as a victor, but as a dominant military power with ambitions of securing its influence over Eastern Europe. Soviet forces occupied vast swaths of territory, and Stalin's regime swiftly began to install communist governments across countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. This post-war reality marked the birth of a starkly divided Europe, one split along ideological lines. On the Western side, the United States and its European partners promoted liberal democracy and market-oriented capitalism, hoping to restore economic prosperity while containing the spread of communism. On the Eastern side, the Soviet Union sought to consolidate control over its satellite states, imposing centralized, authoritarian governments loyal to Moscow. For millions of Europeans, daily life now depended not only on survival, but on navigating a political landscape fraught with suspicion, surveillance, and the often brutal enforcement of ideology. In cities like Berlin, which itself would soon become the epicenter of early Cold War crises, residents began to experience firsthand the pressures of a continent divided not by natural boundaries, but by political doctrine. In March 1947, the United States took a decisive step that would shape the emerging geopolitical order. President Harry S. Truman, addressing Congress, announced what would become known as the Truman Doctrine. He declared that the United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures, a thinly veiled reference to Soviet-backed communist movements. Truman's policy was clear. The United States would no longer retreat from global affairs, but would instead assume a leadership role in countering perceived communist expansion. Greece and Turkey, both under significant political pressure from the Soviet sphere, became the first beneficiaries of this doctrine, receiving U.S. economic and military aid designed to stabilize pro-Western governments. The Truman Doctrine was not merely a policy statement. It was a declaration that the United States viewed the post-war world in binary terms, defining nations as either aligned with freedom and democracy or with authoritarian communism. 1 year later, In June 1948, the Marshall Plan was introduced, named after Secretary of State George C. Marshall. This ambitious program committed over $12 billion in aid, a sum equivalent to more than $130 billion today, to rebuild Western European economies. The plan was designed not only to restore prosperity, but also to prevent the spread of communism by addressing the economic instability that often bred political extremism. Through the Marshall Plan, countries such as France, Italy, West Germany, and the Benelux states received funds to rebuild infrastructure, modernize industry, and stabilize their currencies. While it succeeded in revitalizing much of Western Europe, the plan also widened the ideological divide, as the Soviet Union rejected participation and forbade its satellite states from receiving aid. This economic demarcation mirrored the political and military divisions already forming across the continent. As the West moved to stabilize its nations, tensions with the Soviet Union intensified. In June 1948, Stalin initiated the Berlin blockade, cutting off all land and rail access to West Berlin, which lay deep within the Soviet-controlled zone of Germany. Stalin's objective was clear: force the Western Allies out of Berlin and assert Soviet dominance over the entire city. In response, the United States and Britain launched the Berlin Airlift, a monumental logistical operation that delivered food, fuel, and essential supplies to the 2 million residents trapped in West Berlin. For nearly a year, planes landed every few minutes at Tempelhof and Gatow, defying Soviet attempts to starve the city into submission. The airlift was a tangible demonstration of Western resolve and underscored the reality that Europe's recovery and security could not rely solely on national efforts. Cooperation was essential. These events made it increasingly clear that Western Europe faced a threat that transcended borders. No single nation could withstand the military and political pressure of a resurgent Soviet Union alone. European leaders, alongside American policymakers, began to consider a more formalized system of collective security. Discussions circulated about mutual defense agreements, shared intelligence, and coordinated military planning. The urgency was magnified by the memories of unpreparedness that had plagued the continent during both world wars. Nations recognized that to prevent future devastation, they would need to institutionalize cooperation in a way that went beyond temporary treaties or bilateral alliances. The path to collective defense, however, was not straightforward. Political differences, lingering wartime resentments, and concerns over national sovereignty complicated negotiations. Countries such as France and the United Kingdom were wary of entangling themselves in new obligations that might compromise their independence. Smaller states, scarred by occupation and invasion, feared domination by their more powerful neighbors. Yet the pressures of the time, the Soviet threat, economic instability, and the psychological toll of war made indecision dangerous. By late 1948, a consensus was emerging. The nations of Western Europe could no longer rely on ad hoc arrangements. They required a structured alliance that would guarantee mutual defense and deter aggression. Throughout these early years, the United States played a pivotal role in shaping the vision for this alliance. American leaders recognized that the security of Europe was intimately tied to U.S. interests, both economic and strategic. By committing to collective defense, the United States aimed not only to contain Soviet influence, but also to ensure markets for its products maintained political stability and prevent the rise of extremist movements that could once again plunge the continent into chaos. This strategic thinking reflected a broader transformation in U.S. foreign policy, a shift from isolationism to active engagement in global affairs, one that would define the nation's role for decades to come. Amid the rubble and political uncertainty, the seeds of NATO were planted. The urgency of mutual defense, combined with the lessons of recent history, created a momentum that could not be ignored. Leaders from across Western Europe and North America began negotiating what would become the North Atlantic Treaty, a document that promised not only military cooperation, but also a political commitment to shared values and collective security. These negotiations were delicate and complex, requiring careful balancing of national interests, military capabilities, and ideological alignment. Yet the underlying principle was simple: an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. This principle, later codified as Article 5, would form the cornerstone of the alliance and define its purpose for decades to come. By the end of 1948, as 1949 approached, the stage was set for a momentous decision. The world had witnessed the horrors of global conflict, endured ideological confrontation, and experienced the precarious balance of power firsthand. The creation of NATO would not be a response to abstract threats alone. It would be a tangible answer to the urgent, lived realities of a continent still reeling from the consequences of total war. In this crucible of destruction, fear, and determination, the foundations of one of the most enduring military alliances in history were being forged, a testament to the belief that through cooperation, nations could rise from devastation and prevent history from repeating its darkest chapters. By April 1949, all the planning, negotiation, and urgent strategizing coalesced into a single, decisive moment: the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty. The 12 founding nations would soon formalize their commitment to collective security, marking the beginning of a new era in international relations. Yet, even before the ink dried, the world understood that the journey ahead would be fraught with crises, challenges, and tests of unity. For the people of Europe, NATO represented hope, a promise that the horrors of war could be mitigated, that nations could stand together in defense of liberty, and that a new balance of power, precarious though it might be, could prevent the descent into chaos once again. In retrospect, the period between 1945 and 1948 was more than a prelude to NATO. It was a crucible in which the values, fears, and strategic imperatives of the post-war world were forged. It was a time when leaders and ordinary citizens alike recognized that survival required foresight and solidarity, and that the future of Europe, and perhaps the world, depended upon decisions made in these fleeting, fragile years. The ruins of the continent, the ideological divides, the bold proclamations of the Truman Doctrine, the economic interventions of the Marshall Plan, and the defiant resolve displayed during the Berlin airlift, all of these elements combined to create a context in which the concept of NATO was not only desirable, but necessary. It was in this turbulent, uncertain landscape that the seeds of collective defense were planted, setting the stage for an alliance that would endure, adapt, and shape the course of global history for decades to come. April 4th, 1949, Washington, D.C. The air in the conference room was heavy with anticipation. Delegates from 12 nations, each carrying the weight of their war-torn homelands, gathered to sign a document that would forever alter the geopolitical landscape of the 20th century. The North Atlantic Treaty, more commonly known today as NATO, was poised to be more than a mere agreement on paper. It was to be a living, binding promise of collective defense, a beacon of stability in an uncertain world. The founding members, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Norway, Denmark, Portugal, and Iceland, had all emerged from World War II with one lesson etched indelibly into their consciousness: Europe could not survive another unchecked conflict, and no nation, however powerful, could face threats alone. The creation of NATO was born out of necessity, fear, and strategic calculation. In the years following 1945, Europe had begun to reconstruct itself physically, but politically and militarily, the continent remained fragile. The Soviet Union's rapid consolidation of power in Eastern Europe had alarmed Western governments. Communist regimes were being installed in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania, often under the supervision of Soviet troops and with little regard for popular consent. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, governments were struggling to rebuild economies decimated by years of total war. Inflation ran rampant, social unrest simmered, and political instability threatened to weaken the already vulnerable states. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that leaders realized unilateral defense strategies were no longer sufficient. The security of one nation was inextricably linked to the security of all. The principles underpinning the treaty were revolutionary. At its core lay Article 5, a commitment that an attack against one member would be considered an attack against all. This was not merely a military arrangement. It was a profound political statement. It signaled a collective willingness to intervene on behalf of allies, to share both risk and responsibility. For nations like Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, small states whose survival had been threatened during the Nazi occupation, Article 5 offered a sense of security that was both tangible and psychological. For the United States, it was a mechanism to project stability without immediate resort to unilateral occupation or intervention. And for the United Kingdom and France, it was a reassurance that their security in Western Europe would be bolstered by a transatlantic partnership rather than dependent solely on their own depleted resources. The negotiations leading to the treaty had been fraught with complexity. Each nation approached the table with different priorities. The United States, under the leadership of President Harry S. Truman and Secretary of State Dean Acheson, sought to institutionalize a system that would prevent Soviet aggression while strengthening economic and military ties with Western Europe. Western European nations, still recovering from the devastation of war, wanted guarantees that U.S. involvement would be both sustained and credible. Smaller states insisted on clauses that protected their sovereignty and limited the influence of larger powers. Weeks of discussions, compromises, and political maneuvering culminated in the final treaty text, which balanced these competing interests while maintaining the unity essential for effective deterrence. The treaty was not signed in isolation. It was the culmination of years of incremental security arrangements, discussions, and agreements. From 1947 onward, initiatives like the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan had already set the stage for transatlantic cooperation. Military planning committees had been convened to explore the logistics of joint defense, and preliminary talks had taken place regarding intelligence sharing and the standardization of armed forces across borders. NATO was the logical next step, a formalization of practices and principles that had already been evolving in response to the perceived Soviet threat. The timing of NATO's creation was also critical. In 1948, the Berlin blockade had underscored the fragility of post-war Europe and the potential for conflict to reignite in the heart of the continent. Soviet attempts to cut off West Berlin from supplies demonstrated that aggression could be sudden, strategic, and devastating. The airlift that sustained the city was a remarkable feat of logistics and coordination, yet it also highlighted the limitations of acting alone. Europe needed a framework in which military and political resources could be pooled, in which decisions could be made collectively, and in which an attack on one nation would trigger a unified response. NATO provided that framework, transforming collective defense from an abstract concept into a practical, enforceable reality. The political implications of the treaty were profound. By entering into NATO, member states were effectively drawing a line in the ideological sand. The alliance was explicitly directed against potential Soviet expansion, signaling a clear commitment to defending democratic, market-oriented societies against authoritarian communist regimes. This alignment was not only strategic but also ideological. NATO became a symbol of the Western Bloc, a counterweight to the Warsaw Pact, which would be established a few years later in 1955. The alliance represented a fusion of military capability and political will, demonstrating that the West was united not only in opposition to potential threats, but in the values and governance principles it sought to defend. Beyond politics and ideology, NATO also had a practical military dimension. The alliance facilitated coordination of armed forces across multiple nations, standardization of equipment and procedures, and the establishment of shared military commands. Plans were drawn for the defense of Western Europe, incorporating air, land, and naval forces into integrated strategies. Intelligence networks were established to monitor potential threats, and protocols were developed for joint exercises and contingency planning. NATO became a living organization, one that required constant collaboration, communication, and adaptation, a far cry from the ad hoc alliances that had characterized previous European conflicts. Yet even as NATO was born, challenges loomed. The alliance needed to reconcile differing national priorities, military capabilities, and political philosophies. France, wary of excessive U.S. influence, would later withdraw from NATO's integrated military command in 1966, highlighting the persistent tension between national sovereignty and collective strategy. Smaller states needed reassurance that their security concerns would be taken seriously, while larger powers had to manage the burden of providing sufficient military resources. These dynamics, present from the very beginning, underscored that NATO's strength would rely not only on military capability, but on the ability to navigate complex political relationships. The creation of NATO also had immediate effects on the broader international system. The Soviet Union, perceiving the alliance as a direct threat to its sphere of influence, accelerated efforts to consolidate control over Eastern Europe. The division of Germany into East and West, and the subsequent formation of the Warsaw Pact, can be traced directly to the establishment of NATO. In this sense, the alliance did not merely respond to a geopolitical reality. It reshaped it, forcing both blocs to clarify their positions, align their strategies, and prepare for the possibility of confrontation. The world had entered a new era, one in which collective defense, nuclear deterrence, and ideological alignment would define international relations for decades. For the ordinary citizens of the 12 founding nations, NATO represented both hope and reassurance. It promised that no nation would stand alone against aggression, that democratic values would be defended collectively, and that the lessons of the past, lessons of unchecked ambition, appeasement, and devastation, would not be forgotten. The alliance symbolized a commitment to stability, to foresight, and to the principle that cooperation across borders could prevent the horrors of another total war. The signing of the North Atlantic Treaty on April 4, 1949, was thus more than a ceremonial act. It was the crystallization of years of negotiation, planning, and hard-earned wisdom born of a world war that had exacted a staggering toll. It established a framework for military coordination, political unity, and ideological alignment that would shape the contours of international relations throughout the Cold War and beyond. Article 5, the principle of collective defense, would later be invoked only once in NATO's history after the September 11th attacks in 2001, yet its presence from the outset signaled a profound commitment. An attack on one member would trigger the resolve of all. This was a bold, unprecedented step, one that carried with it both risk and moral weight. As the ink dried on the treaty, the world began to witness the tangible consequences of NATO's formation. The alliance provided a platform for joint military exercises, coordinated defense planning, and shared intelligence operations. It encouraged political dialogue and consensus building, fostering a sense of community among Western nations that had previously been fractured by conflict and rivalry. NATO's existence also had a psychological dimension. It reassured populations that security was collective, that aggression would not go unanswered, and that the lessons of history, of isolation, appeasement, and vulnerability had been internalized. By establishing NATO, the founding nations did more than create a military alliance. They crafted a symbol of resilience and unity. They demonstrated that even in the shadow of unprecedented destruction, diplomacy, foresight, and collective action could forge a pathway toward stability. The alliance became a living testament to the idea that the security of one nation is inseparable from the security of others, a principle that would guide Western policy throughout the ensuing decades of tension, confrontation, and adaptation. From its very inception, NATO was an experiment in balancing national interests with collective responsibility. It required trust, negotiation, and a willingness to accept shared burdens. It demanded that nations confront threats not in isolation but in unison, that they reconcile historical grievances with present imperatives, and that they navigate the complexities of alliance politics with patience and resolve. In doing so, NATO laid the foundation for what would become one of the most enduring and consequential military alliances in modern history, shaping the trajectory of the Cold War, influencing global strategy, and redefining the possibilities of international cooperation. The birth of NATO on April 4, 1949, thus represents a pivotal moment in the 20th century. It was not merely a response to fear, nor solely a strategic maneuver. It was a deliberate, thoughtful construction of a system designed to preserve peace through collective strength. For the nations involved, for the citizens who would benefit from its protection, and for the world at large, NATO's creation marked the beginning of a new order, one in which unity, foresight, and shared responsibility became the pillars upon which security and stability would rest for generations to come. June 1950. The world watched as the Korean Peninsula erupted into violence, a conflict that would soon claim millions of lives and reshape the geopolitical landscape of East Asia. While the fighting raged thousands of miles away, the repercussions were felt acutely in Europe. NATO, barely a year into its existence, confronted the reality that the ideological struggle between East and West was not confined to the European continent. The Korean War became a stark demonstration that Soviet-backed expansionism was a global threat, that communism could no longer be contained by national borders alone, and that the alliance created in 1949 would have to adapt quickly to new forms of conflict. The outbreak of hostilities in Korea was precipitated by North Korea's invasion of the South on June 25, 1950. Backed implicitly by the Soviet Union and later by China, North Korean forces advanced rapidly, capturing Seoul within days. Western nations, particularly the United States, interpreted this as a test of resolve and a signal of the broader ambitions of the communist bloc. For NATO members, the lesson was unmistakable. The ideological and military struggle against Soviet influence could manifest anywhere, and the security of the Atlantic Alliance could not be taken for granted. Though NATO was formally a European alliance, its relevance now extended to the emerging global order, linking the security of the North Atlantic to distant theaters of war. In response, NATO undertook its first coordinated military exercises. These were not mere drills. They were a demonstration of collective resolve, a tangible assertion that the alliance was capable of rapid mobilization in the face of existential threats. Western Europe, still recovering from the devastation of the Second World War, required reassurance that the United States and its allies would honor the commitments enshrined in Article 5, even if the immediate threat appeared geographically remote. Military planners focused on the integration of forces, standardization of equipment, and the development of communication protocols that could allow a seamless response in the event of a Soviet incursion into Western Europe. These early exercises were formative, setting the tone for decades of NATO operational doctrine and highlighting the alliance's dual function: deterrence and preparedness. Simultaneously, the specter of nuclear weapons loomed large over NATO's strategy. By 1950, the United States had already demonstrated the devastating potential of atomic bombs in Japan, and the Soviet Union had conducted its first successful test in 1949. This new reality transformed the calculus of military planning. The United States embraced the doctrine of nuclear deterrence, pledging that any Soviet aggression would be met with overwhelming retaliatory force. Yet within NATO, the implications were complex. France and the United Kingdom debated the role of nuclear weapons in collective defense, weighing the moral, political, and strategic consequences of atomic warfare. Germany, a country still recovering from occupation and division, was cautiously reintegrated into Western defense planning, reflecting both the necessity of its contribution to European security and the lingering anxieties over its potential militarization. The early 1950s were also a period of institutional consolidation for NATO. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, was established in 1951, creating a unified military command structure under the leadership of American General Dwight D. Eisenhower. This innovation allowed NATO to coordinate strategies across multiple nations, synchronize intelligence operations, and plan joint responses to potential Soviet offensives. SHAPE represented more than a military organization. It was a tangible embodiment of the alliance's political commitment, a signal that collective defense was operationally viable and that member states were prepared to act in concert rather than as isolated actors. Meanwhile, political tensions within the alliance required delicate management. Each member state brought distinct national interests, historical grievances, and strategic priorities to the table. France, still recovering from wartime occupation, was sensitive to the perceived dominance of larger powers, particularly the United States. Smaller states, such as Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, were keenly aware of their vulnerability and sought explicit guarantees of protection. Negotiators and policymakers had to reconcile these differences while maintaining the credibility. Intelligence gathering became an essential component of NATO's early strategy. The alliance developed networks for sharing information on Soviet troop movements, military technology, and political developments within Eastern Bloc countries. Surveillance of air and land activity along the Iron Curtain became routine, and NATO analysts worked to anticipate potential Soviet strategies, from conventional invasions to subversive operations. This intelligence-sharing framework not only improved military preparedness, but also fostered trust among member nations, reinforcing the political cohesion that was crucial for the alliance's survival. Public perception and morale were equally important. Citizens of NATO countries, many of whom had endured years of wartime devastation, needed reassurance that the alliance was capable of protecting their nations. Leaders employed public diplomacy to highlight NATO's role as a deterrent, framing the alliance not as an instrument of aggression, but as a guardian of stability, freedom, and sovereignty. The combination of military exercises, intelligence coordination, and public messaging established NATO as a credible force, capable of deterring potential adversaries while fostering domestic confidence in the post-war security order. The Korean War also prompted NATO to reassess its doctrines and force posture. While the alliance's founding principle emphasized collective defense against direct attacks on member states, the conflict illustrated the need for flexibility in responding to indirect threats and global contingencies. Discussions began regarding rapid deployment forces, contingency planning for peripheral theaters, and the integration of air, naval, and land operations into a coherent strategic framework. These debates were foundational, shaping NATO's approach to crisis management and intervention for decades to come. Technological innovation further influenced NATO's strategy during the 1950s. Advances in radar, jet aircraft, and communications systems transformed the nature of defense planning. The ability to detect, track, and respond to potential Soviet incursions became increasingly sophisticated, and NATO invested heavily in research, infrastructure, and training. These technological investments were not merely military necessities. They represented a broader commitment to maintaining a qualitative edge over potential adversaries, reinforcing the credibility of the alliance's deterrence posture. As the decade progressed, NATO's credibility was tested repeatedly. Incidents along the Iron Curtain, espionage activities, and political provocations served as constant reminders of the stakes involved. The alliance responded not only through military preparedness, but also through diplomacy, ensuring that lines of communication remained open to prevent miscalculation while signaling its resolve. The balance between deterrence, diplomacy, and readiness became a defining feature of NATO's early identity, illustrating the complex interplay between strategy, politics, and perception in the Cold War environment. By the mid-1950s, NATO had evolved from a fledgling organization into a coherent, credible alliance. It had established a permanent military command structure, standardized operational procedures, and cultivated the political cohesion necessary to respond to emerging threats. The Korean War had acted as a catalyst, reinforcing the urgency of collective defense and demonstrating that ideological confrontation could not be contained to a single region. NATO's members had learned that deterrence required not only military capability, but also political unity, strategic foresight, and the ability to project credibility to both allies and adversaries. The early Cold War crises of the 1950s thus solidified NATO's role as the cornerstone of Western security. The alliance was no longer an abstract concept. It was a living, operational entity capable of coordinating complex military strategies, integrating diverse national forces, and adapting to unforeseen challenges. It represented a new form of international organization, one in which sovereignty and collective responsibility were intertwined, and in which the security of one member could not be separated from the security of all. As the decade drew to a close, NATO faced new challenges, from the development of more sophisticated nuclear arsenals to the evolving political dynamics within member states. Yet the foundation laid during these early crises, through exercises, intelligence sharing, doctrine development, and political coordination, ensured that the alliance was prepared to navigate these uncertainties. The lessons of the Korean War, combined with the realities of a divided Europe, underscored a simple but enduring truth. NATO's strength lay not in any single nation's power, but in the unity, coordination, and resolve of the alliance as a whole. By the end of the 1950s, NATO had proven its resilience and strategic relevance. The alliance had transformed collective defense from a theoretical principle into an operational reality, capable of responding to threats both near and far. The early Cold War crises had tested its structures, doctrines, and cohesion, and the alliance had emerged stronger, more coordinated, and more credible than at its inception. NATO had become not only a guarantor of European security, but also a symbol of transatlantic solidarity, ideological commitment, and strategic foresight, a force that would continue to shape global politics for decades to come. By the 1960s, NATO had matured from a fledgling alliance into the cornerstone of Western security, but its path forward was neither simple nor assured. The decade opened with both internal and external pressures, testing the cohesion, strategy, and identity of the alliance. The Cold War, far from abating, intensified in both scope and sophistication. Nuclear weapons had become central to military planning, and technological advancements in missiles, aircraft, and surveillance systems were rapidly reshaping the landscape of deterrence. NATO's challenge was to adapt to these transformations while maintaining unity among members with diverse political, economic, and military priorities. One of the most defining moments of this era occurred in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Although geographically distant, the Caribbean confrontation brought NATO members face to face with the possibility of global nuclear war. The discovery of Soviet ballistic missiles in Cuba, capable of striking the United States, ignited a 13-day confrontation that brought the world closer to annihilation than at any point since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. NATO's role was indirect but essential. Its member states supported U.S. efforts, coordinated military readiness in Europe, and contributed to intelligence gathering. The crisis reinforced the alliance's fundamental purpose: to provide a collective security framework capable of responding, deterring, and managing the escalating threats posed by the Soviet Union. Yet NATO's cohesion was tested not only by external threats, but by internal dynamics. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, grew increasingly skeptical of U.S. dominance within the alliance. In 1966, de Gaulle made the historic decision to withdraw France from NATO's integrated military command while retaining political membership. This move forced the alliance to relocate its headquarters from Paris to Brussels and prompted a re-evaluation of command structures and strategic planning. France's partial withdrawal highlighted the delicate balance NATO had to maintain, ensuring collective defense while respecting the sovereignty and national interests of its members. Despite the political friction, NATO adapted, demonstrating its capacity for resilience and flexibility, qualities that would prove essential in the decades to come. Meanwhile, the technological revolution was transforming the alliance's operational capabilities. Advances in radar, early warning systems, and aircraft design expanded NATO's ability to detect, deter, and, if necessary, respond to potential Soviet aggression. The development of intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear submarines introduced new layers of strategic complexity. NATO planners emphasized deterrence through both conventional and nuclear forces, creating overlapping layers of defense designed to dissuade any adversary from considering a first strike. The alliance's investment in technology was not simply about military superiority. It was a psychological signal, demonstrating to both allies and adversaries that the collective will of the West was backed by unmatched capability. During this period, NATO also expanded its exercises and strategic planning to include new forms of coordinated defense. Military commanders conducted large-scale maneuvers simulating Soviet incursions, integrating air, naval, and land forces from multiple member states. Intelligence sharing became more sophisticated, linking early warning systems across the Atlantic and establishing protocols for rapid decision-making. These preparations were not abstract. They were a response to the very real possibility of conflict along the European frontiers. The combination of advanced technology, rigorous planning, and collective commitment underscored NATO's evolution from a political treaty into a comprehensive security apparatus. Beyond the strictly military dimension, NATO's consolidation reflected broader political and ideological objectives. The alliance became a symbol of Western unity, a tangible manifestation of the shared commitment to democracy, market economies, and the defense of national sovereignty. In an era when the Soviet Union was consolidating its influence over Eastern Europe, NATO represented the counterweight, a statement that Western nations, despite their differences, would not allow coercion or aggression to succeed. Publicly, NATO promoted a vision of solidarity and deterrence. Privately, leaders grappled with the complexities of maintaining cohesion amid diverging national interests, defense budgets, and strategic priorities. Economic recovery also played a crucial role in consolidating NATO's strength. By the 1960s, Western Europe had largely rebounded from the devastation of World War II, aided initially by the Marshall Plan and later by growing industrial and technological capacity. Stronger economies allowed member states to invest more substantially in defense, providing the resources necessary to modernize armed forces, acquire new technologies, and participate fully in collective exercises. This economic foundation was essential, for a military alliance is only as credible as its members' ability to sustain forces and uphold commitments over time. NATO's consolidation during this period was as much about economic stability as it was about military strategy or political ideology. The 1960s and 1970s also saw NATO responding to a rapidly changing geopolitical environment. Decolonization in Africa and Asia reshaped global power dynamics, while the emergence of new nation-states created additional arenas for ideological competition. The alliance recognized that threats to stability could emerge far from Europe's borders, whether through insurgency, political subversion, or proxy conflicts. Although NATO's Article 5 commitments were geographically specific, the strategic calculus of its members now had to consider a broader, interconnected world. This period of reflection and adaptation set the stage for NATO's eventual involvement in crises beyond Europe, demonstrating the foresight and flexibility embedded in the alliance's institutional culture. The internal politics of NATO were equally dynamic. Disagreements over nuclear strategy, particularly regarding the deployment of U.S. missiles in Europe, created tension among member states. Some nations, wary of escalation, favored conventional deterrence. Others insisted that nuclear weapons were essential for credible defense. These debates were often intense, reflecting divergent historical experiences, national doctrines, and political philosophies. Yet the capacity to negotiate, compromise, and maintain collective unity despite disagreement became a defining feature of the alliance. NATO's strength lay not in the uniformity of its members' perspectives, but in their ability to synchronize action when shared principles and threats demanded it. By the late 1960s, NATO had also begun to institutionalize mechanisms for strategic planning and crisis management. Standing committees, coordinated intelligence centers, and joint military staffs allowed the alliance to respond more efficiently to emerging challenges. These structures facilitated both long-term defense planning and immediate operational decision-making, enhancing NATO's credibility as a unified force. They also served a diplomatic function, providing forums in which member states could resolve disputes, align policies, and maintain cohesion. In essence, NATO had become not only a military alliance, but a political community bound by shared interests, common threats, and a collective vision of security. Externally, NATO's presence acted as a stabilizing influence in Europe. The alliance's integrated military structures, visible troop deployments, and coordinated exercises served as a deterrent to Soviet adventurism. The division of Germany, the ongoing presence of U.S. forces in Europe, and the signaling provided by NATO maneuvers made clear that any attempt at aggression would encounter unified and coordinated resistance. This strategic posture helped prevent direct conflict in Europe during one of the tensest periods of the Cold War, demonstrating the practical value of collective defense in preserving stability and averting escalation. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, NATO also emphasized the importance of technological and doctrinal innovation. Military thinkers within the alliance explored the integration of air defense, nuclear strategy, and conventional forces to create a flexible, multi-layered deterrent. Advances in communications, surveillance, and logistics allowed the alliance to operate more efficiently, while joint exercises reinforced interoperability among member states' militaries. These developments were not merely technical. They reflected a broader strategic philosophy. NATO's effectiveness depended on the integration of capabilities, the credibility of its commitments, and the clarity of its political purpose. As the alliance consolidated, it became clear that NATO's significance extended beyond military matters. It represented a political and cultural commitment to shared values, democratic governance, and the defense of sovereignty. Its presence reassured populations in Western Europe that the horrors of the past, occupation, war, and the threat of subjugation would not be repeated. It also sent a clear message to adversaries. The West was united, prepared, and capable of defending its interests. This symbolic dimension of NATO, intertwined with its operational capabilities, contributed to its enduring relevance and influence. By the mid-1970s, NATO had successfully navigated the challenges of internal disagreements, technological evolution, and external threats. The alliance had endured the departure of France from the integrated military command, adapted to nuclear and conventional strategic complexities, and reinforced its credibility in the eyes of both members and adversaries. Its consolidation during this period laid the groundwork for future adaptation, demonstrating that the strength of the alliance lay not only in its military power, but in its ability to evolve, integrate, and maintain unity amid an unpredictable global environment. Ultimately, the expansion and consolidation of NATO in the 1960s and 1970s revealed a fundamental truth. The alliance's endurance depended on more than treaties or military hardware. It required vision, adaptability, and a shared commitment to collective security. Through technological innovation, doctrinal development, political negotiation, and strategic foresight, NATO emerged as a robust, credible, and flexible alliance. It had become the Western bulwark against Soviet expansion, a symbol of unity and resilience, and a foundation upon which the security architecture of Europe, and indeed the broader transatlantic world, would rest for decades to come. The 1970s arrived with a sense of cautious optimism, yet beneath the surface, the Cold War remained a tense and evolving struggle. NATO, by now well established as the bulwark of Western security, found itself navigating a complex landscape of political détente, technological advancement, and persistent Soviet military power. While the world had hoped that the mid-1970s might bring a reduction in global tensions, the realities of nuclear proliferation, ideological confrontation, and regional instability ensured that NATO's vigilance remained essential. The decade demanded a strategic balance, engagement with the Eastern Bloc to reduce the risk of confrontation, while simultaneously reinforcing military readiness and alliance cohesion. The period of détente, formalized through agreements such as the Helsinki Accords of 1975, marked a high point in efforts to ease tensions between East and West. These accords addressed issues ranging from human rights to economic cooperation, creating a framework for dialogue between NATO members and Warsaw Pact nations. Yet détente was never a surrender to complacency. NATO continued to modernize its forces, coordinate defense strategies, and refine nuclear deterrence policies. The alliance recognized that diplomacy alone could not guarantee security. Credible military capability remained the ultimate guarantor of Western stability. One of the most contentious issues of the decade was the deployment of intermediate-range nuclear forces, INF, in Europe. The Soviet Union's introduction of SS-20 missiles, capable of striking NATO capitals with high precision, prompted alarm in Western capitals. NATO responded with the decision to deploy Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles in allied countries, a move that sparked protests across Europe and raised fears of escalation. The debate over nuclear deployment revealed the tensions inherent within NATO. Member states were united in principle but divided in approach. While some governments viewed the deployments as essential for deterrence, others feared that stationing nuclear weapons on European soil would make their countries targets in the event of conflict. The Warsaw Pact, formally established in 1955 as a counterbalance to NATO, remained the primary military threat throughout this period. Comprising the Soviet Union and its satellite states in Eastern Europe, the pact fielded formidable conventional and nuclear capabilities, creating a constant strategic challenge for NATO planners. Exercises, intelligence assessments, and contingency plans were continuously updated to account for potential Warsaw Pact maneuvers. NATO's doctrine emphasized flexible response, a strategy designed to deter aggression at multiple levels, ranging from conventional troop invasions to full-scale nuclear exchanges. The alliance's capacity to coordinate across multiple nations and military branches became increasingly critical as the sophistication and scale of potential threats grew. NATO's strategy during the 1970s also reflected lessons learned from previous crises. The Korean War, Berlin confrontations, and the technological innovation continued to shape NATO's strategy during this period. Advances in missile technology, aircraft capabilities, electronic warfare, and reconnaissance systems significantly enhanced the alliance's deterrence and operational readiness. Surveillance networks were expanded to monitor Warsaw Pact activities, and intelligence sharing mechanisms became increasingly sophisticated. NATO's investment in research and development was not simply about maintaining parity with the Soviet Union. It was about creating qualitative advantages that would reinforce the credibility of its deterrent posture. The alliance's emphasis on innovation highlighted a broader principle. In an era of rapidly advancing military technology, staying ahead of potential adversaries was as much about strategy and planning as it was about equipment. Public opinion and civil society also played a role in shaping NATO policy. The deployment of nuclear missiles and ongoing military exercises provoked protests and debates across member states, reflecting widespread anxiety about the risks of escalation and the specter of nuclear war. NATO leaders recognized the importance of maintaining legitimacy, not just operationally, but politically. Public diplomacy, education, and communication strategies were employed to explain the necessity of deterrence, the logic of flexible response, and the value of alliance cohesion. In this sense, NATO's strategy was as much about perception and psychological assurance as it was about tangible military capability. The Warsaw Pact's activities continued to provide a constant backdrop of tension. Large-scale exercises in Eastern Europe, the modernization of conventional forces, and the strategic positioning of nuclear assets underscored the persistent threat to NATO's eastern flank. The alliance responded with its own exercises, intelligence assessments, and contingency planning, creating a delicate equilibrium. Both sides sought to avoid direct conflict while signaling their readiness to respond decisively if necessary. NATO's ability to manage this balance was a testament to its organizational sophistication and the political will of its member states. The alliance also expanded its focus to include crisis management and coordination beyond immediate territorial defense. Regional conflicts, political instability, and the potential for Soviet intervention in peripheral areas demanded that NATO consider the broader strategic environment. Planning included not only the defense of Western Europe, but also potential engagements that could influence the global balance of power. This strategic foresight became a hallmark of NATO's approach, emphasizing the alliance's adaptability and its capacity to anticipate threats before they materialized into active conflicts. By the late 1970s, NATO had firmly established itself as both a political and military entity capable of managing complex challenges. The alliance had weathered internal disputes, adapted to technological change, and maintained credible deterrence against a formidable adversary. Its strategic doctrine of flexible response, its investment in modernized forces, and its emphasis on political cohesion ensured that NATO remained a central pillar of Western security. The combination of military preparedness, technological innovation, and political unity allowed the alliance to navigate an era of both détente and underlying tension, demonstrating resilience in the face of uncertainty. NATO's endurance during this period was not solely a product of its military capabilities. It reflected a sophisticated understanding of international politics, the necessity of alliance management, and the interplay between perception and reality. The alliance's leaders recognized that credibility was built not only through weapons and exercises, but through consistent commitment, diplomatic negotiation, and the cultivation of trust among member states. This holistic approach reinforced NATO's stability and ensured that the organization could respond effectively to both anticipated and unforeseen challenges. As the 1980s approached, NATO's experience during the 1970s provided a foundation for adaptation and modernization. The lessons of détente, the management of internal political tensions, the integration of new technologies, and the strategic assessment of Warsaw Pact capabilities all informed subsequent planning. NATO had evolved from a nascent collective defense organization into a complex, adaptive alliance capable of balancing military readiness, political cohesion, and strategic foresight. Its endurance was a testament to the careful calibration of deterrence, diplomacy, and institutional resilience, ensuring that it would remain a defining force in global security for decades to come. In retrospect, the 1970s were a period of both consolidation and preparation. NATO had strengthened its operational capabilities, refined its strategic doctrines, and reinforced its political cohesion. It had navigated the challenges of internal disagreements, technological change, and the persistent threat of the Warsaw Pact with skill and foresight. By balancing engagement with the Eastern Bloc through diplomatic initiatives like the Helsinki Accords while maintaining robust military readiness, NATO demonstrated the adaptability that would become a hallmark of its enduring relevance. The alliance's experiences during this decade would shape its approach to the crises, expansions, and strategic recalibrations of the 1980s and beyond, confirming its place as the cornerstone of Western security and a global actor capable of influencing the trajectory of international relations. November 9, 1989. The world watched in awe as the Berlin Wall, a symbol of division and oppression for nearly 3 decades, fell in a cascade of concrete and steel. Crowds surged over the barrier, citizens of East and West Germany embracing, laughter mingling with tears, as the Cold War's most potent icon of separation crumbled. For NATO, this moment was both exhilarating and disorienting. The alliance had been created to counter a specific threat, the expansionist policies of the Soviet Union, and now that threat was rapidly diminishing. The collapse of the Berlin Wall, followed by the unraveling of communist regimes across Eastern Europe, signaled the end of an era and posed a profound question. What was NATO's purpose in a world where its primary adversary seemed to vanish overnight? The 1980s had been a decade of tension, strategy, and recalibration. Under the leadership of figures like U.S. President Ronald Reagan and NATO Secretary General Joseph Luns, the alliance had navigated the challenges of a resurgent Soviet military, rapid technological innovation, and political disagreements among member states. The deployment of intermediate-range nuclear forces, large-scale exercises, and the modernization of conventional and nuclear arsenals had ensured that NATO remained credible as both a deterrent and a political actor. Yet, the unexpected rapidity of change in Eastern Europe forced the alliance to reconsider its identity and strategic mission. The events leading to the end of the Cold War were complex and interwoven with economic, political, and social factors. The Soviet Union, burdened by economic stagnation, bureaucratic inefficiency, and the costly arms race, struggled to maintain its control over Eastern Europe. Policies such as Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost aimed at reforming the Soviet system inadvertently accelerated its unraveling. Reformist movements gained momentum across Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other Eastern Bloc countries, emboldened by a weakening Soviet grip and the promise of political self-determination. For NATO, these developments were unprecedented. Decades of strategic planning, exercises, and deterrence were now occurring in a rapidly transforming political landscape where the central threat was disappearing. Yet NATO did not fade into irrelevance. Instead, the alliance demonstrated remarkable adaptability. The leaders of member states recognized that while the Soviet Union's collapse reduced the risk of large-scale conventional war in Europe, new challenges would emerge, requiring a shift in strategy rather than dissolution. NATO's focus began to move from collective defense against a monolithic adversary to broader concepts of crisis management, peacekeeping, and engagement beyond traditional borders. This evolution marked a profound redefinition of NATO's mission, transforming it from a purely defensive military alliance into a versatile instrument capable of addressing a variety of security challenges. Germany's reunification in 1990 was both a triumph and a logistical challenge for NATO. The integration of the Federal Republic of Germany with the former East Germany required careful coordination to ensure that military structures, alliances, and defense planning were consistent with NATO objectives. The alliance's role in supporting stability during this period was subtle yet crucial. By providing a framework for security guarantees, NATO reassured neighboring states that the reintegration of Germany would not destabilize the European balance of power. It was a delicate exercise in diplomacy, planning, and symbolic reassurance, reflecting NATO's growing sophistication in it. The early 1990s also highlighted NATO's growing role in crisis management. Conflicts in the Balkans, although fully erupting later in the decade, began to signal the complexity of post-Cold War Europe. The alliance recognized that while conventional large-scale war was less likely, ethnic, regional, and humanitarian crises could destabilize the continent. NATO's strategic planning began to incorporate flexibility for rapid response, humanitarian intervention, and coordination with international organizations such as the United Nations. This period marked a shift in thinking. NATO could no longer rely solely on deterrence. It had to develop capabilities for active engagement in multifaceted, evolving conflicts. NATO's adaptation was also reflected in its internal reforms. Military command structures were streamlined, planning mechanisms updated, and cooperative exercises redesigned to reflect a changing strategic environment. Emphasis was placed on interoperability, rapid deployment, and the integration of multinational forces for diverse missions. Intelligence sharing networks were expanded to monitor emerging threats, from regional conflicts to political instability in formerly Soviet-aligned states. The alliance's ability to respond cohesively to the unexpected dissolution of its primary adversary demonstrated its institutional resilience and capacity for strategic foresight. Public perception of NATO also evolved during this period. Citizens across member states had long understood the alliance in terms of deterrence against Soviet aggression. The sudden collapse of the Eastern Bloc challenged this perception, raising questions about NATO's continued relevance. Alliance leaders addressed these concerns through messaging that emphasized NATO's ongoing role in preserving peace, supporting democratic transitions, and ensuring stability in a Europe undergoing profound political transformation. By framing NATO as a guarantor of order rather than merely a counterforce, the alliance maintained legitimacy and public support during a period of dramatic change. Economically, the post-Cold War era allowed NATO members to reconsider defense spending priorities. Resources could now be allocated not only to traditional military capabilities, but also to modernization, infrastructure, and operations that addressed new security challenges. The end of the Cold War did not eliminate threats, it transformed them. NATO's investments in logistics, technology, and rapid deployment forces reflected a recognition that security in the 1990s would require flexibility, intelligence-driven operations, and the ability to act decisively in crises ranging from ethnic conflict to terrorism. The alliance also faced philosophical debates about its purpose and scope. Some critics argued that without the Soviet Union, NATO's raison d'etre was diminished, and calls for disbandment or downsizing emerged in political circles. Proponents, however, highlighted that Europe's security remained fragile and that NATO's continued existence could facilitate stability, provide a platform for political dialogue, and support the orderly transition of former adversaries into cooperative relationships. This debate underscored a fundamental reality. NATO's endurance depended not on the presence of a single adversary, but on its ability to adapt to shifting political, military, and strategic landscapes. By the conclusion of the Cold War, NATO had successfully transitioned from a purely defensive alliance into a more versatile institution capable of addressing diverse security challenges. The fall of the Berlin Wall, German reunification, and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact collectively redefined the alliance's strategic environment. NATO responded with foresight, adaptability, and institutional reform, setting the stage for its involvement in the conflicts and interventions of the 1990s and the expansions of the 2000s. The alliance had not only survived the disappearance of its founding adversary, but had positioned itself to remain a central actor in global security. In retrospect, the period from 1989 to 1991 represents a pivotal moment in NATO history. The alliance's ability to maintain cohesion, adapt strategically, and expand its mission beyond traditional collective defense demonstrated a level of institutional maturity rarely seen in international organizations. NATO had transformed from a reactionary force into a proactive actor, capable of shaping security outcomes rather than merely responding to them. The lessons of these years, flexibility, foresight, and unity in the face of rapid geopolitical change, would inform NATO's actions for decades to come. As it confronted new challenges in a post-Cold War world that was simultaneously full of opportunity and fraught with uncertainty. The Cold War may have ended, but NATO's story was far from over. The alliance had survived the ultimate test of purpose, the disappearance of its raison d'etre. By adapting to the new reality, embracing crisis management, and expanding its strategic vision, NATO ensured that it would remain relevant, capable, and influential in shaping the security of Europe and the wider world well into the 21st century. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not the end of NATO's history. It was the beginning of its transformation, a metamorphosis that would define its mission for the next decades and cement its place as the world's most enduring military alliance. The 1990s opened a new chapter in NATO's history, one defined not by the looming threat of the Soviet Union, but by the unpredictable chaos of post-Cold War Europe. The alliance, once focused almost exclusively on collective defense against a single monolithic adversary, now faced a world of regional conflicts, ethnic violence, and humanitarian crises. The disintegration of Yugoslavia, a multi-ethnic federation long held together by the iron grip of Josip Broz Tito, quickly became NATO's first significant post-Cold War test. What began as political unrest escalated into brutal wars in Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and eventually Kosovo, revealing both the limitations and the evolving potential of the alliance in the absence of its traditional existential threat. The Bosnian War, which erupted in 1992, was a complex tapestry of ethnic tensions, nationalist ambitions, and competing international interests. Bosnia and Herzegovina, newly independent following the breakup of Yugoslavia, found itself engulfed in a violent struggle between Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs. The conflict was marked by widespread atrocities, including ethnic cleansing, siege warfare, and mass displacement. For NATO, the war posed a dilemma. Intervention could prevent further humanitarian catastrophe, yet direct military action risked entangling the alliance in a complex, multipolar conflict with no clear front lines or conventional objectives. The stakes were high, for failure to act could undermine NATO's credibility as a guarantor of European stability. In response, NATO initially engaged through air support, surveillance, and the imposition of no-fly zones, operations that were largely coordinated with the United Nations. The 1993 enforcement of the no-fly zone over Bosnia demonstrated the alliance's growing willingness to operate in crisis management roles, projecting power beyond its traditional defensive perimeter. By 1995, NATO took a more assertive stance, launching air campaigns to enforce peace agreements and pressure warring factions into negotiations. These operations were carefully calibrated, reflecting lessons learned from decades of deterrent strategy. Precision, restraint, and credibility were paramount. NATO's aircraft, operating from bases in Italy and other member states, executed sorties designed to degrade military capabilities without escalating into full-scale war, a balancing act that required meticulous planning and coordination among alliance members. The Kosovo War of 1998 to 1999 represented another critical test of NATO's evolving role. The conflict, driven by the repression of ethnic Albanians in Kosovo by Yugoslav forces under Slobodan Milosevic, escalated into widespread violence, displacement, and the threat of regional destabilization. NATO's response, a sustained air campaign beginning in March 1999, marked a significant departure from previous doctrines. For the first time in its history, the alliance conducted military operations without explicit authorization from the United Nations Security Council, highlighting both the moral imperatives and the political controversies inherent in post-Cold War interventions. NATO's bombing campaign, aimed at degrading Yugoslav military infrastructure and compelling a ceasefire, demonstrated the alliance's ability to project power decisively, but also sparked debates about sovereignty, international law, and the ethical responsibilities of military force. Internally, these interventions required NATO to confront significant operational and political challenges. Coordination among 16 member states, each with its own military capabilities, rules of engagement, and domestic political considerations, tested the alliance's cohesion. Decisions had to balance national sensitivities with alliance-wide objectives, ensuring that operations maintained legitimacy and effectiveness. Intelligence sharing, air traffic coordination, targeting selection, and logistical support demanded unprecedented levels of collaboration. The Kosovo campaign, in particular, illustrated NATO's growing institutional competence, highlighting how decades of political debates within NATO were inevitable. Some member states, particularly those with pacifist traditions or memories of occupation, were cautious about military interventions beyond their borders. Others argued that the alliance's credibility and moral authority depended on decisive action in the face of atrocities. These discussions were not merely academic. They shaped operational timelines, the selection of targets, and rules of engagement. NATO's ability to navigate these internal debates while maintaining unity was a testament to the alliance's institutional maturity, built over decades of managing divergent national interests within a collective framework. The Balkan conflicts also highlighted the importance of intelligence and surveillance in modern NATO operations. Satellite imagery, electronic monitoring, and human intelligence networks provided the alliance with critical information for planning and executing missions. Real-time data allowed NATO commanders to adjust strategies dynamically, coordinate multinational forces, and minimize collateral damage while maximizing operational effectiveness. These capabilities, refined over decades of Cold War preparation, proved essential in the unpredictable and fluid environment of regional conflicts, demonstrating that NATO's investment in technology and coordination had enduring value beyond the original East-West confrontation. Humanitarian considerations became intertwined with strategic objectives. Refugee crises, civilian casualties, and the destruction of infrastructure demanded that NATO operations be carefully calibrated to achieve military goals while mitigating human suffering. The alliance increasingly collaborated with international organizations, NGOs, and the United Nations to address the humanitarian dimensions of conflict. This dual focus on military effectiveness and moral responsibility reflected a broader evolution in NATO's identity. It was no longer sufficient to defend borders. The alliance now had to navigate the complex ethical and operational challenges of intervention in sovereign states experiencing internal conflict. By the end of the 1990s, NATO's interventions in the Balkans had established several important precedents. The alliance demonstrated that it could conduct sustained military operations beyond its traditional defensive perimeter, coordinate complex multinational forces, and influence the political outcomes of regional conflicts. At the same time, these operations revealed the limits of military power, particularly in environments characterized by ethnic complexity, guerrilla tactics, and international legal ambiguity. NATO's experiences in Bosnia and Kosovo informed subsequent strategic planning, highlighting the necessity of flexible doctrine, rapid deployment capabilities, and the integration of political, military, and humanitarian considerations into a coherent operational framework. The Balkan conflicts also reshaped NATO's perception in global politics. The alliance emerged as not just a guarantor of European territorial integrity, but as a credible actor in international security, capable of engaging with crises wherever they threaten stability. This transformation required NATO to balance historical commitments to collective defense with the emerging responsibilities of crisis management, signaling a shift in both mission and identity. NATO's reputation, previously defined by deterrence and defensive credibility, now encompasses the ability to intervene decisively and responsibly in complex conflicts, laying the groundwork for the interventions and missions of the 21st century. NATO's experience in the 1990s also influenced its institutional development. Lessons learned from air campaigns, coordination challenges, and political negotiations led to reforms in command structure, decision-making processes, and operational planning. Standardization of equipment, interoperability among member forces, and rapid response planning became central priorities. Training exercises increasingly simulated real-world scenarios involving asymmetric warfare, humanitarian contingencies, and multinational coordination. These reforms reflected an understanding that NATO's future relevance depended not only on maintaining collective defense, but on the ability to project power, manage crises, and adapt to a complex and rapidly changing security environment. By the close of the decade, NATO had demonstrated its capacity for evolution. The alliance had confronted conflicts that were neither conventional wars nor nuclear standoffs, testing its political resolve, operational flexibility, and ethical frameworks. Bosnia and Kosovo had illustrated both the challenges and the potential of a post-Cold War NATO, an alliance capable of influencing outcomes, enforcing stability and responding to crises while navigating the complexities of international law, domestic politics, and the unpredictability of modern conflict. NATO had emerged from the 1990s not as a relic of a bygone era, but as a versatile and enduring institution, prepared to meet the security challenges of the new century. In retrospect, NATO's interventions in the 1990s were transformative. The alliance had shifted from a defensive bulwark against a clearly defined adversary into a proactive, multidimensional security actor. Through air campaigns, surveillance operations, peacekeeping coordination, and political negotiation, NATO demonstrated that it could act decisively in crises that threatened stability, even when operating outside traditional legal and geographic boundaries. The lessons of these years, adaptability, coordination, and strategic foresight, would inform NATO's operations in Afghanistan, Libya, and beyond, shaping the alliance into a global force capable of confronting the unpredictable threats of the 21st century. The 1990s cemented NATO's evolution from a Cold War military alliance to a flexible, politically sophisticated organization. The experiences of Bosnia and Kosovo illustrated that the alliance's strength lay not only in military capability, but in its ability to integrate strategic planning, diplomacy, and humanitarian considerations into coherent action. NATO had successfully navigated its first post-Cold War crisis, demonstrating resilience, adaptability, and relevance. The alliance had proven that even in a world without its founding adversary, it could define new roles, meet emerging threats, and influence the trajectory of global security. The dawn of the 21st century presented NATO with a world that was dramatically different from the Europe of the 1940s or the Cold War landscapes of the 1980s. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the challenges of the 1990s had redefined the alliance's mission. It was no longer sufficient to defend borders against a single adversary. NATO now faced complex, asymmetric threats emerging from regions far beyond its traditional sphere, requiring it to rethink strategy, expand partnerships, and project power in unprecedented ways. The early 2000s became a transformative era, during which NATO's relevance was tested, its scope expanded, and its capabilities evolved to meet the demands of a rapidly globalizing security environment. The expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe was perhaps the most significant strategic shift of this period. In 1999, three former Warsaw Pact countries, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, officially joined the alliance, marking a historic milestone. These additions were more than symbolic. They represented the consolidation of a post-Cold War European order, the integration of formerly adversarial states into a shared security framework, and a powerful statement of NATO's enduring relevance. The accession of these nations required careful diplomacy, military integration, and reassurances to Russia, which viewed the eastward expansion with suspicion and apprehension. NATO had to balance the strategic imperative of expansion with the delicate task of avoiding renewed confrontation with Moscow, demonstrating the alliance's growing sophistication in international politics. The tragic events of September 11, 2001, fundamentally altered NATO's trajectory. For the first time in its history, Article 5, the cornerstone of the alliance guaranteeing that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all, was invoked. Terrorist attacks on the United States shattered the illusion that NATO's purview was strictly regional. Suddenly, the alliance's responsibilities were global, encompassing threats from non-state actors, asymmetric warfare, and transnational terrorism. NATO responded by coordinating support for U.S. led operations in Afghanistan, marking the beginning of its first major expeditionary campaign outside Europe. This intervention demanded unprecedented levels of coordination, intelligence sharing, and logistical planning, testing the alliance's ability to operate beyond its historical theaters and against adversaries unlike those of the Cold War. Operations in Afghanistan were complex and multifaceted. NATO forces were tasked not only with combating insurgency, but also with training local security forces, assisting in reconstruction efforts, and providing humanitarian support. The alliance had to integrate a wide array of military, political, and civilian capabilities to stabilize the country and support the fledgling government. For many member states, this represented a significant departure from traditional defense doctrines focused on conventional warfare in Europe. Beyond Europe and Afghanistan, NATO's capabilities were further tested in Libya in 2011. The uprising against Muammar Gaddafi, part of the broader Arab Spring, posed a threat to regional stability and raised urgent humanitarian concerns. Acting under United Nations Security Council resolutions, NATO launched an air campaign aimed at protecting civilian populations and enforcing a no-fly zone. The intervention illustrated the alliance's ability to project power far from its traditional base, coordinating air, naval, and intelligence assets from across the Atlantic. The Libyan operation, while operationally successful in degrading Gaddafi's military capacity, also sparked debates about intervention, sovereignty, and the limits of alliance action, highlighting the complexities NATO faced in a globalized, multipolar world. The early 21st century also demanded adaptation to emerging threats beyond traditional military challenges. Cybersecurity, hybrid warfare, and disinformation campaigns became central concerns. NATO began developing frameworks for cyber defense, recognizing that attacks on infrastructure, communication networks, or critical systems could be as destabilizing as conventional military operations. Exercises simulated cyber attacks on member states, testing both defensive capabilities and rapid response protocols. These efforts reflected a recognition that 21st century security was multidimensional, encompassing technology, information, and global connectivity alongside conventional military considerations. Internally, NATO faced the persistent challenge of maintaining cohesion amid diverse threat perceptions, political priorities, and economic capacities. Disputes over defense spending, the scope of expeditionary missions, and burden sharing created tension among member states. The alliance navigated these challenges through diplomacy, consensus building, and institutional reforms aimed at enhancing decision-making efficiency and operational readiness. Despite differing national agendas, NATO demonstrated a capacity for unity, recognizing that collective action was essential to address complex threats and maintain credibility in a rapidly changing global environment. Strategically, NATO's focus in the 2000s reflected a balance between traditional collective defense and proactive crisis management. While Article 5 remained the foundation, the alliance increasingly embraced out-of-area operations, understanding that threats to one member could emerge from distant regions. NATO developed rapid response forces, specialized units, and coordinated planning mechanisms to operate in diverse theaters, from Afghanistan's mountains to Libya's deserts. The ability to project power, coordinate multinational forces, and adapt to dynamic situations became a defining feature of the alliance, distinguishing it from its Cold War posture and reinforcing its relevance in a globalized security landscape. The expansion into Eastern Europe, the intervention in Afghanistan, and the operations in Libya collectively reinforced NATO's dual identity, a defensive alliance committed to the protection of its members and a proactive actor capable of shaping security outcomes globally. These developments were not without controversy. Critics questioned the legality, ethical implications, and strategic wisdom of interventions, while supporters emphasized the necessity of decisive action to prevent humanitarian catastrophe, uphold international norms, and maintain stability. NATO's ability to navigate these debates while continuing operations underscored its institutional maturity and adaptability. NATO's transformation in the 2000s also involved strengthening partnerships beyond formal membership. The Mediterranean Dialogue and the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative created forums for dialogue, joint exercises, and capacity building with non-member states, fostering regional stability and encouraging alignment with NATO standards. These partnerships reflected a forward-looking vision. Security in the 21st century required not only robust military capability, but also cooperation, trust building, and the integration of diverse actors into a coherent framework capable of addressing shared challenges. By the end of the decade, NATO had demonstrated that it could adapt to a rapidly changing world without abandoning its core principles. The alliance had expanded its geographic reach, modernized its operational capabilities, embraced technological innovations, and assumed a global role in crisis management. NATO's evolution was characterized by flexibility, strategic foresight, and a commitment to collective action, ensuring that the organization remained central to international security even in the absence of its Cold War adversary. The 2000s confirmed that NATO's relevance in the 21st century depended on its ability to integrate multiple dimensions of security: conventional defense, crisis management, humanitarian assistance, cyber protection, and global partnerships. The alliance's interventions in Afghanistan and Libya, combined with its expansion into Eastern Europe, illustrated a sophisticated understanding of modern threats and a willingness to act decisively when stability, security, or humanitarian imperatives demanded it. NATO had transformed from a regional defensive alliance into a global actor, capable of projecting power, coordinating multinational forces, and shaping the course of international security in complex and unpredictable environments. In retrospect, the early 21st century represented a turning point in NATO's history. The alliance's response to new threats, its strategic expansion, and its operational engagements demonstrated adaptability, resilience, and enduring relevance. NATO had evolved from its Cold War origins into a versatile institution capable of addressing both traditional military threats and emerging security challenges. Its interventions, partnerships, and reforms during this period laid the groundwork for future missions, technological integration, and strategic planning, ensuring that the alliance would remain a central pillar of global security well into the 21st century. The story of NATO in the 2000s is one of transformation, ambition, and adaptation. From integrating former adversaries into the alliance to confronting terrorism and projecting power in distant regions, NATO demonstrated that its purpose extended beyond simple collective defense. It had become a global actor, capable of shaping outcomes, influencing political developments, and maintaining stability in a world characterized by complexity, uncertainty, and rapid change. The early 21st century proved that NATO's evolution was not merely a response to circumstance, but a deliberate, strategic recalibration, securing its place as the most enduring and powerful military alliance in human history. The 2010s presented NATO with a world that was simultaneously familiar and profoundly transformed. The alliance, once forged to contain the Soviet Union and defend Western Europe, now faced a landscape defined by hybrid threats, regional instability, and the emergence of new global powers. Cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and asymmetric warfare challenged the very concept of traditional defense, forcing NATO to rethink strategy, doctrine, and readiness. The crises of the decade would test not only the alliance's military capabilities, but also its political cohesion, adaptability, and relevance in an increasingly multipolar world. One of the most significant events of this period was the 2014 annexation of Crimea by Russia. This sudden and aggressive action shocked the international community, highlighting that the post-Cold War order was fragile and that regional aggression could erupt with little warning. NATO, bound by its commitment to collective defense, faced the delicate task of reassuring Eastern European member states without escalating tensions into open conflict. Rapid deployments of multinational battle groups to the Baltic states and Poland exemplified NATO's principle of deterrence by presence, a visible and credible demonstration of alliance solidarity designed to discourage further aggression. The alliance's swift response underscored the enduring relevance of Article 5. Even in a security environment where threats were more diffuse and unpredictable than in the Cold War era. The rise of hybrid warfare marked another defining feature of the 2010s. Unlike conventional military campaigns, hybrid threats combine cyber attacks, propaganda, covert operations, and economic pressure to achieve strategic objectives without triggering a direct military confrontation. NATO recognized that adversaries could target member states in ways that blurred the lines between peace and war, challenging traditional doctrines of defense and deterrence. In response, the alliance invested heavily in cyber defense capabilities, intelligence sharing, and strategic communications, creating structures to detect, deter, and respond to attacks in the digital and informational domains. Exercises simulated complex hybrid scenarios, emphasizing rapid decision-making, coordination across national boundaries, and resilience against asymmetric threats. The conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa further tested NATO's operational scope and strategic judgment. The rise of the Islamic State, ongoing instability in Syria, and continued unrest in Libya created a security environment in which threats could spill over into Europe. NATO engaged in a combination of intelligence support, aerial surveillance, and logistical coordination with partner nations to mitigate these risks. While the alliance was NATO's adaptation in the 2010s also involved organizational and doctrinal reform. The Readiness Action Plan, launched in response to heightened tensions with Russia, aimed to ensure the rapid deployment of forces to vulnerable regions. Multinational battle groups, pre-positioned equipment, and enhanced command structures were designed to reduce response times and increase deterrence credibility. At the same time, NATO expanded partnerships with non-member states and regional organizations, recognizing that global security increasingly depended on cooperation beyond formal membership. These reforms reflected a proactive approach, emphasizing not just the defense of territory, but the management of threats that were fluid, unpredictable, and transnational in nature. Cybersecurity became central to NATO's operational planning. Attacks on critical infrastructure, government networks, and private institutions demonstrated that modern conflicts could bypass traditional military front lines. NATO's response involved both defensive measures and strategic signaling, reinforcing the alliance's commitment to protecting member states while establishing norms for cyber engagement. Exercises simulated multi-vector cyber attacks, testing coordination, resilience, and rapid response, reflecting an understanding that security in the 21st century extended beyond guns, tanks, and aircraft to encompass the digital domain. The alliance also faced the challenge of balancing deterrence with diplomacy. Tensions with Russia required careful messaging. A robust military posture reassured member states in the Baltics and Eastern Europe, while channels of communication sought to prevent escalation and manage crises. NATO's dual approach demonstrated that security was not merely about force projection, but also about strategic patience, credibility, and the cultivation of predictable, disciplined responses in the face of provocations. The alliance's capacity to combine hard and soft power became a defining feature of its resilience. Public perception and political legitimacy remained critical concerns. Citizens across Europe and North America increasingly questioned NATO's relevance in a world where threats were complex and sometimes indirect. Leaders within the alliance emphasized the evolving nature of security, highlighting that NATO's mission had expanded from defending borders against conventional attack to addressing terrorism, cyber threats, and regional instability. Public diplomacy, media engagement, and education about the alliance's activities became integral to sustaining support and demonstrating that NATO remained both necessary and effective in the modern era. The decade also highlighted NATO's global responsibilities. Partnerships with countries in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Asia-Pacific region reflected the alliance's recognition that security challenges were not confined to the North Atlantic. Collaborative exercises, intelligence sharing, and capacity-building initiatives allowed NATO to project influence, foster stability, and mitigate risks in regions critical to global security. These initiatives reinforced the notion that NATO's role had become not just defensive but preventive, shaping security environments before conflicts could escalate into crises threatening member states. By the late 2010s, NATO had demonstrated remarkable adaptability. It had navigated a decade of unprecedented challenges, including hybrid warfare, cyber threats, regional aggression, terrorism, and internal political divisions. The alliance had proven capable of rapid deployment, multinational coordination, and strategic flexibility, ensuring that it could respond to both conventional and unconventional threats with credibility and coherence. NATO's enduring relevance in this period rested on its ability to integrate military capability with political strategy, intelligence, and diplomacy, creating a multidimensional security framework capable of meeting the unpredictable challenges of the modern world. The 2010s confirmed that NATO's identity was no longer tied solely to the Cold War. While collective defense remained the foundation of the alliance, it had evolved into a versatile organization capable of projecting influence, managing crises, and addressing threats that span continents, domains, and modalities. The decade's experiences, particularly the challenges posed by Russia, cyber warfare, and global terrorism, highlighted the necessity of continuous adaptation, strategic foresight, and institutional resilience. NATO had not only survived a changing security landscape, but had positioned itself to remain central to international stability in the decades ahead. In retrospect, the period from 2010 to 2020 underscored a central truth about NATO. Survival and relevance in the modern era depend on agility, cohesion, and foresight. The alliance had weathered multiple crises, balanced internal divisions, and expanded its strategic vision to include threats far beyond conventional borders. By embracing new domains of conflict, reinforcing readiness, and cultivating partnerships, NATO demonstrated that its historical legacy of deterrence and collective defense could be translated into effective action in an increasingly complex, interconnected, and unpredictable world. The modern challenges of the 2010s, cyber attacks, hybrid aggression, regional instability, and political divergence, were not obstacles but tests of NATO's institutional maturity. The alliance responded with adaptability, demonstrating that its mission had evolved from a narrow focus on territorial defense to a broad commitment to stability, security, and cooperative action across multiple domains. This evolution ensured that NATO remained a preeminent military alliance in the world, capable of responding to threats while maintaining political legitimacy, operational credibility, and strategic foresight. As the decade drew to a close, NATO faced the daunting task of preparing for the future while maintaining readiness in the present. The lessons of the 2010s, cohesion in the face of internal disagreements, adaptability in the face of evolving threats, and the integration of new technologies and strategies would guide the alliance into the 2020s and beyond. The alliance's ability to confront modern challenges while remaining rooted in its foundational principles of collective defense, deterrence, and stability affirmed its continued relevance and influence in global security. As the 21st century unfolds, NATO stands at a crossroads, a military alliance forged in the crucible of post-World War II geopolitics, tempered by the Cold War and continuously reshaped by the challenges of a changing global order. From its modest beginnings in 1949, when 12 nations pledged to defend one another against the specter of Soviet expansion, NATO has grown into a sprawling alliance of 31 members across North America and Europe, wielding military, political, and diplomatic influence unparalleled in modern history. Its longevity and adaptability are remarkable, yet the modern world poses challenges that are simultaneously new and familiar, requiring the alliance to balance legacy commitments with innovative strategies for contemporary security threats. Today, NATO faces a geopolitical environment marked by unpredictability, complexity, and an expanding spectrum of threats. Traditional state-based conflicts, once the core focus of the alliance, are now complemented by non-state actors, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, terrorism, and regional instability. Russia's resurgence, particularly following the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and military involvement in eastern Ukraine, underscores that conventional military threats have not disappeared. Simultaneously, the rise of China as a global power introduces strategic considerations beyond the North Atlantic, compelling NATO to reassess global security dynamics and the potential need for coordination in trans-regional theaters. These emerging challenges highlight the necessity of maintaining credibility, cohesion, and rapid responsiveness across all domains of modern warfare. Internally, NATO continues to grapple with the perennial challenge of consensus building among its member states. 31 nations, each with distinct political priorities, military capabilities, and threat perceptions, must align their strategies to act cohesively. Defense spending disparities remain a source of tension, with the United States repeatedly urging European allies to meet the target of 2% of GDP dedicated to defense. Differing political approaches to crises, whether in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, or Africa, require careful negotiation, coordination, and compromise to ensure that NATO retains both operational effectiveness and political legitimacy. The alliance's enduring strength lies not merely in its military power, but in its ability to unite diverse nations under a shared strategic vision, even in the face of domestic and international pressures. Cybersecurity and hybrid warfare are central concerns in today's NATO strategy. Adversaries increasingly exploit digital vulnerabilities, targeting critical infrastructure, political institutions, and information networks to destabilize societies without engaging in conventional conflict. NATO has invested heavily in cyber defense, establishing the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Estonia, enhancing member state collaboration, and conducting exercises designed to simulate large-scale cyber incidents. These measures reflect an understanding that modern conflict is as much about information dominance, technological resilience, and psychological impact as it is about tanks, ships, or aircraft. Protecting digital frontiers has become as vital to collective security as defending physical borders, and NATO continues to adapt its doctrines accordingly. The alliance's operational scope, partnerships with non-member states, and regional organizations have become increasingly important in this era. NATO maintains cooperative relationships with nations across the globe through programs such as the Partnership for Peace, the Mediterranean Dialogue, and the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. These partnerships enable intelligence sharing, joint exercises, and capacity building, reinforcing the alliance's ability to respond to threats that transcend national borders. NATO recognizes that global security is inherently interconnected, and that resilience in one region often depends on cooperation, trust, and coordination with actors beyond the alliance itself. Technological innovation is another critical dimension of NATO's contemporary relevance. Advanced missile defense systems, unmanned aerial vehicles, cyber tools, and intelligence networks have transformed how the alliance projects power and maintains deterrence. Modern threats are multidimensional, encompassing conventional, nuclear, cyber, and hybrid domains, and NATO's strategy reflects this complexity. Investments in research, development, and standardization across member states ensure that NATO remains capable of responding effectively to both traditional and unconventional challenges, maintaining the credibility necessary to deter adversaries and reassure allies. Despite its successes, NATO faces strategic dilemmas. The balance between deterrence and diplomacy, engagement and restraint, expansion and stability remains delicate. The inclusion of new members, particularly those bordering Russia, continues to provoke geopolitical tensions. The challenge is to reassure Eastern European allies while avoiding unnecessary escalation with major powers. NATO's strategic calculus requires constant adaptation, projecting strength without provoking conflict, deterring aggression without undermining diplomacy, and responding rapidly while maintaining consensus among diverse member states. These challenges underscore the alliance's ongoing relevance. Security in the modern world is neither automatic nor static. It is actively negotiated, maintained, and defended. Public perception and legitimacy continue to shape NATO's role. Citizens in member states increasingly demand transparency, accountability, and clear articulation of objectives, particularly when engaging in operations far from national borders. NATO has responded with public diplomacy, outreach, and efforts to demonstrate the alliance's operational effectiveness and moral authority. By framing its actions as essential to collective defense, stability, and the protection of democratic values, NATO sustains its legitimacy in an era where public opinion can influence political decision-making and operational priorities. As the world moves deeper into the 21st century, NATO faces a strategic landscape defined by uncertainty and flux. Emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, and space-based surveillance will reshape the nature of conflict, while global interdependence amplifies the consequences of regional crises. Climate change, mass migration, and economic instability introduce additional dimensions to security planning, requiring NATO to consider threats that extend beyond traditional military parameters. The alliance's challenge is to remain agile, innovative, and unified in the face of evolving risks that may not resemble the wars of the past. Yet despite these challenges, NATO's core mission endures. The principles of collective defense, deterrence, and cooperative security continue to underpin its strategy. The alliance demonstrates that survival and relevance in a turbulent world depend on more than military power. They require strategic vision, political cohesion, adaptability, and the willingness to embrace new domains and partnerships. NATO's story, from a 12-nation alliance formed in 1949 to a 31-member coalition confronting 21st-century threats, is a testament to institutional resilience, foresight, and the enduring appeal of collective security in an unpredictable world. The modern NATO is a hybrid entity, part guardian of territorial integrity, part crisis manager, part global actor. Its missions are complex, its responsibilities broad, and its operational environments increasingly challenging. Yet the alliance continues to demonstrate that decades of experience, careful planning, and institutional adaptability enable it to confront threats that are political, military, technological, and humanitarian in nature. NATO's continued evolution illustrates a fundamental lesson. Security is not static, and survival depends on the ability to anticipate, adapt, and act decisively. Looking forward, the questions surrounding NATO's future are profound. Can it maintain unity in the face of internal divergences? Will it continue to deter adversaries while adapting to emerging technologies and unconventional threats? Can it balance expansion, engagement, and diplomacy without provoking instability? These questions are not merely academic. They define the strategic choices that will shape global security for decades to come. NATO's history demonstrates that the alliance has faced existential questions before and has repeatedly adapted, evolved, and emerged stronger. Its ability to do so again will determine its relevance in an increasingly complex world. Ultimately, NATO today represents both continuity and transformation. It is a living testament to the vision of nations that, decades ago, chose to bind themselves together in the pursuit of collective security. Yet it is also a dynamic, evolving institution, learning from experience, integrating innovation, and adapting to a world that bears little resemblance to the Europe of 1949. From the ruins of post-World War II Europe to the battlefields of Afghanistan and the air campaigns over Libya, NATO's trajectory has been shaped by both challenge and opportunity, crisis and foresight. 75 years after its founding, NATO remains the preeminent military alliance in the world, a coalition capable of deterring aggression, managing crises, and projecting stability across multiple continents and domains. Its enduring relevance depends not on the absence of threats, but on its ability to adapt to them, politically, militarily, and technologically. In a world defined by rapid change, uncertainty, and complexity, NATO stands as a testament to the power of collective action, the necessity of foresight, and the enduring importance of unity in the pursuit of security. Its story is far from complete, yet its lessons are clear. Resilience, adaptability, and shared purpose are the cornerstones of survival and influence in an unpredictable world.